Hello, this is Gio. Hey, look what I have here. I have a Sega Game Gear. Now, this is an 8-bit handheld gaming system from Sega, which was manufactured in the early 1990s and was made to directly compete with the Nintendo Game Boy, the Atari Lynx, and also the NES Turbo Express. And these were actually really good handheld game systems. They did eventually lose to Nintendo's Game Boy, but they did actually have a lot of good games, and they played well. They were kind of big. I think that was one of the problems. Also, they tended to use a ton of batteries, 3 on this side, 3 on that side. And so that's one of the reasons they weren't as popular, just they were kind of battery hogs. But they were still really good systems with a lot of cool games in the day. Well, I picked up this one, but this one doesn't quite work very well. It does power on. The screen does sort of show very lightly. It's not that bright at all, but the sound doesn't work much at all. You can maybe hear just a very faint sound coming out of the speakers. The headphone jack, kind of works. It's a little louder, but not that loud at all. So there are some issues. I'm wondering if the screen also might have some issues. There's some lines, especially right after boot up. But let's go ahead and turn this thing on and show you what's going on. Now, also the battery compartment, I think there was some battery acid corrosion. There's a little bit of contact issue. I could kind of get the battery sort of working, but I'm gonna have to clean these contacts so they don't quite work right now, but it does power on with a plug. So we'll go ahead and plug it in, and let's see if we can angle it. And you can see the lines initially, and you can see just barely, you can see Sega come up. You can't even see it at all well straight on, but you can kind of barely see it. You can see the screen. It's very faint, but you can see it. Again, you can't hear any sounds coming from the speaker, but yes, from the head jack, you can hear a faint sound. And yes, so this Game Gear is starting to show its age and needs a little TLC. So as these systems age, one of the things that tends to go wrong is the capacitors tend to die out. They get old, they don't work as well, and sometimes they bleed out onto the board and perhaps cause board damage. And so a lot of times, if you replace the capacitors in these handhelds, it actually solves a lot of your problems. And so I'm hoping that if I do a recap of this system, I will get perhaps some better illumination of the screen. Maybe the sound will come back, and at least we might solve a lot of the issues. I'm thinking maybe it needs a whole new monitor, but I'm hoping after the recap, maybe that will solve the problem. So let's go ahead and recap this thing today. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is open it up, and there's a bunch of screws in the back where you have to remove the battery covers here to access 2 of them. I think I took most of them out, but there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe. There's also, and these are just standard Phillips. There's also a Game Bit one right here where I believe, so that's the only tricky one. I believe it's a 4.5. Yes, it's a 4.5 Game Bit screw that you need to remove there. So that's a little bit of a specialty one. You can get those online. But first things first, you got to remove all these little screws. And then with all the screws removed, you just want to carefully kind of pry off this back part, and you're just going to kind of rotate it upwards like this. There's no hinge, but there is a few wires, and there's these little metal parts there that kind of hook up to everything. And then there are 3 little connectors, 1, 2, 3, that you just want to pull out to separate these 2 sides. And then one right there. There you go. And so what we're looking at, this is the main motherboard here. This is a little reflective shield for the light. There's a little kind of a backlight underneath that, and then the monitor below that. And then on this side, you get, these are the little battery compartments here. This is a little board. This is the sound board end, and this is the power board. So that's where all the power comes into the system. Okay, so for this side of the game, the monitor side, this is really all you need to remove. Some people like to take this board out to get better access for these capacitors here, but when you do that, the monitor actually kind of flops out. You might actually even have to remove the monitor, which is a soldering job in itself. So I recommend just keeping everything in this outer case, and there's no surface mount underneath. There's only the capacitors up on top. And so what are the capacitors we're trying to remove? Well, it's these little kind of brick-shaped things, like there's a longer one right here. There's several of them, so all these, there's one down here. On the other side, there's like, let's see, there's a couple there. But it's basically these little brick-shaped things that we need to remove. There's also these smaller little capacitors right here, but these are ceramic capacitors. These are electrolytic capacitors, and these don't really last as long, and these are what cause the problems. The ceramic ones really don't cause much issues at all, and they tend to age a lot better. Now, if you're used to seeing more of a kind of like circular, kind of a barrel shape, kind of like this, but let's see, that's not a capacitor. Let's see, like something like this. This is the typical electrolytic capacitor there. Well, these things are actually that shape. It's just surrounded with a plastic case. So if you kind of look at the end, like right here, you can see they're circular, and you can actually break these off, and they just look like little circular capacitors inside this outer plastic case. Now you can see that they are polarized, negative, plus, and so you have to be aware when you replace these. I'm going to replace most of them with the electrolytic replacements. You could also get smaller ones like these ones. You can get the ceramic kind that are non-polarized. You don't have to worry about polarization on that. I think I'm going to replace a couple of these with some ceramics, but mostly I'm going to replace them with electrolytic, more modern kind, and so you have to be aware of plus minus side when you reinstall. Now all these capacitors should be labeled. This one says 100. Now that's 100 microfarads at 6.3 volts. Now you need to match the capacitance, the 100, but the voltage you can actually go higher. You don't want to go lower, but if you have, let's say, 100 microfarad capacitor at 10 volts, that's fine, as long as you it's above the required the voltage that you're taking out. So you will need a number of capacitors for the recap job, and here I have basically organized a bunch of capacitors that I have. Again, each one of these should say the capacitance and the voltage rating on them. I believe that this is an 820 6.3 volt capacitor here. There are lots of kits you can buy online. You can go on to eBay, you can go on to other websites that where you can buy the whole set of capacitors based on which Game Gear you have. Now if you look at the monitor side, let me zoom in a little bit here. On this side, there are several generations of boards, and the capacitor layout is slightly different. So some of them are similar, other ones have different ratings, capacitance ratings, etc. Some of them are in slightly different locations. And so right here, my board right here is an if I could read this, 837 9024. So that's kind of the number you're looking for. And so you want to match kind of this board number with the capacitor kit that you purchase. Some kits just give you everything that you could possibly need. Others, you need to specify the actual motherboard number, and then they'll send you the specific capacitors you need. And some of the kits are just electrolytic like these, or some of them actually will send you the smaller ceramic capacitors. It's really up to you. The smaller capacitors work just fine. Sometimes they're a little harder to install, especially if you have big fingers and poor eyesight. But either way, they will both work. So what do you need to actually do this job? Well, first of all, you do need a soldering iron, and this is just a standard one. This is not, I can't control the temperature on this. This is just a 30-watt soldering iron. You need, of course, some solder. This is just some resin core solder here, 6040. Even if you're using a resin core solder, I do recommend just having some flux on the sideline. You could either have it in the, like paste forms like this, or a little pen form that is more fluid. And definitely having some solder wick is very important, so you could clean off the old solder. Now you could also perhaps use some of these suckers that help suck up the solder. Here's a couple of examples, but because of the small size of the components you're dealing with, the wick is really the best and you can clean up really nicely. And then having some isopropyl alcohol with some Q-tips to clean off the board after you desolder or resolder things, remove the flux, etc. And then you should probably have some really sturdy, either some tweezers, or in this case, I have just some really kind of little tiny pliers here with a little needle tip. Also, you may want little snips just like this, or something you can kind of pry up the capacitors. Now the capacitors, these capacitors are actually kind of glued on there. These little plastic boxes around the main capacitor are actually glued onto the board. So not only do you have to desolder the capacitors on one end, but before you do that, you want to break that glue off. And that takes a little bit of skill. You could either prime underneath with a little thin tool and crack that glue. That could, cause some stress to the board, or you can use these little needle pliers to kind of get underneath them and kind of pop them and break them off. When you do that, you just want to be careful of the components around them. Don't damage those, but you will need to break that glue bond somehow, and you could either do that with a small little prior little thin tool, or these little really thin snips. And if you're anything like me and have bad vision, you probably need something to kind of get close up to the work you're working on. I have this magnifier light. You kind of light the thing you're working on, and that really helps me out. You could also use little handheld, but you probably need something so you can really see your work really clearly. Okay, so first I want to kind of crack this glue, and again, there's lots of components around here, so you just want to be careful. I'm just going to get really underneath it like this and sort of pry it up and pop it up just like that. So the glue is cracked. And so because of its location to some of the other components, I'm going to try to just stand it up high like that, and that'll expose those little solder points there. And with my heated soldering iron, I'm just going to apply a little bit of solder to both of them just to kind of get it to kind of prime them for removal. And then I'm just going to try to touch both leads at the same time, or go back and forth, just heat them up separately until it pops up just like that. And there's the component. I am just going to apply a little bit of flux just to help the cleaning process. That'll help the wick, the solder wick work. And then I'm just going to use the solder wick to get rid of that residual solder. And I'll clean it up with some isopropyl alcohol. Then I want to examine these pads really carefully, making sure that the capacitor perhaps didn't leak and damage the traces. I'm kind of looking, I don't need to remove all this glue here, but I need to see underneath to make sure that all these traces are fine. These traces, looks like there's no damage, so I think this will work just fine. I don't have to repair any traces. So here's the capacitor I want to replace it with. I've already trimmed the legs. Again, the negative side was closest to the camera there, and so the negative side of the capacitor is on that side. And so I'm going to install the negative leg first. Just add a little flux to these little pads, just a little bit. Add a little solder to these pads. Preparation. And it's easier just to do one leg at a time. We'll go ahead and then now for the other leg. There you go, it looks nice. Clean off the flux a little bit. And this capacitor is installed. And so with the first one done, I just need to do the exact same thing to all these capacitors. Now, one thing to note, you'll notice these big round circles here. There's a big one there and then 3 smaller ones. Now, those kind of correspond to these little circles here. Let's see, there's one right there, there. And those basically come in contact with those points. So when you orient your capacitor, you just want to make sure that these don't lie in the area of those pads. So just make sure that they are clear of those. It might get tight right around here, but just be aware you don't want to cover up these little pads. Okay, so I think I'm done recapping the main board. Again, there were 2 over here. There was one there, couple there. There's a couple of, I replaced these with ceramics. So there was 2 there, 2 there, and this big one there. This big one was a little hard to get out because it's close to the plastic connector here. You don't want to burn those or melt those any plastic parts when you're using your soldering iron. And you can kind of see the orientation of these capacitors. I had to be careful with, if you look at the top cover here, now this folds over like this. This battery compartment is kind of high, or I don't know how you describe it. Well, it kind of takes up all this room, and so you can't really stand up this capacitor too high. In fact, I had to unsolder this one and resolder it because it was just sticking up too high. And so you have to think about the case, the top case, as it goes over this. So you have to make sure that, see, these 2 capacitors here have to be away from this pad so it could accommodate this little post here. You have to think about this case too, and making sure that the capacitors you're installing aren't in the way and won't prevent the covers from matching. Now, for the most part, the capacitors I removed were in pretty good shape. I didn't really see much leakage at all, except for about 3 of them. There was one right here that had some leakage, and so I had to clean that off. And especially these 2 that I replaced with ceramics, those had quite a bit of powdery residue and some, I had to clean off the contacts really well, the pads. I just basically took a little tiny nail, as you can kind of see here, and scraped it very lightly, not to damage the contacts or the traces around them. But I did have to clean those off at bare minimum so I could have a good clean contact pad to resolder down. but also to examine the traces around it to make sure that there was no damage of the traces. And fortunately, there was not, so I didn't have to do any repairs to the traces themselves. But so there was at least 3, maybe there might have been a 4th that had some leakage, but that was probably the problem. And so I'm interested in seeing how this thing runs. And so before I do the soundboard and the power board, I'm going to just connect this together just to make sure. You don't want to replace all your caps without testing. You want to do sections at a time. I could have done this and then retested, done this and retested, because you kind of want to know what capacitors perhaps were causing the problems. And if you install capacitors wrong, you want to make sure that you don't want to replace them all and then wonder which one was installed wrongly, or which capacitor is bad. Okay, so let's reassemble this thing. Let's see, that goes like that. So just plug in these plugs again. Okay, and then carefully, hopefully this all will close. Make sure everything's good. Seems like it all closes up okay, so the capacitors aren't in the way. We'll just keep it like this for now. No screws. Let's go ahead and put in a game. There's that. Let's see, the power's off. We'll go ahead and plug it in. And so let's go ahead and test her out. And there you go. Geez, let's get the light out of here. So you can see the adjustment of the screen from the brightest there to dimmer. Believe it or not, this is actually working really good. In the day, these color monitors, which the original Game Boy did not have, but the Game Gear did. This was pretty advanced, but it was a pretty washed out screen, and you kind of had to rotate it to get the best view. In the day, this was quite an advancement. Today, they haven't really aged well, but this is much better than I originally had. So I'm really happy about this. So I at least solved the screen problem. I still don't have any sound. Turn up the sound. No, so I'm sure there's some caps that need replacement in the soundboard. I'm not sure about the power board, but I will replace those caps as well. And so let's do that next. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the power board, the soundboard. Now the power board has, I believe, 3 capacitors you want to replace. Now these are punch-through capacitors, so these actually go through the actual board. And so we definitely need to remove this board so we could desolder and resolder those. And on the soundboard, they are still surface mount, but you see these are more traditional surface mount capacitors there. They're a little difficult to remove, but I'll show you a technique by which to remove them with hopefully not damaging the board. So let's go ahead and get these little boards out of here. Now you do need to remove this little shield here to get the soundboard out, and that I believe 4 screws just like that, so we might as well do that now. And it's easy as that. Put those aside. And so the soundboard, there's a couple of screws there and there that we need to remove, and that should take the soundboard out. So this should take the soundboard. And there's the soundboard for you. Now the power board has this little kind of plastic little shielding. I'm not sure what this is. It's kind of glued to the battery compartment here, and there's actually a little metal part right here that it's glued to. I've seen people peel away here to get, and then just kind of bend this up, or I like to, instead of bending that, I'd like to take the whole thing off. So, well, not actually the whole thing off, but I like to unseal it from here And so just kind of lift it up carefully. I'm trying to do this without damaging it, so it'll look okay. And if you want, you could glue it back down, or you could just leave it kind of loose. It doesn't really hurt anything when you reinstall. So there, that's loosened up. So let's go ahead and remove, there should be 2 screws here, one right there and one right there for the power board. Let's unscrew. There's 2, and hopefully I've loosened that up sufficiently. There's only 2 screws, right? Maybe I didn't unglue it enough. There we go. There we go. And then it should just kind of work its way out. There's a little switch here that you just have to rotate out. And then kind of lift it out. And there you go. Now there's a little plastic, this for the power. Now it only goes one way. It is directional, so you can kind of see there's like 3 little lines there. If you could see that, there's one right up on there that essentially goes on top. So it is oriented like that. If you reverse it, it doesn't quite work as well, but there you go. That's the power board. So let's put that aside. Okay, so we will start with the power board. There's 3 capacitors we're going to replace. This one, this one, this one. I think this one's a 22 microfarad, 35 volt. This one is, I think, 100 microfarad, 25. And this one, this big one here is a 820 microfarad, 6.3 volt. I'm going to replace, this is 22 microfarads. I have a 50 volts, so that should do fine. And again, these are punched through the board. So basically we're going to desolder them on this side. And so the first thing we need to do is verify. So we're desoldering these little 2 points. So let me just trim these a little shorter, like that. And commonly you don't even need to remove the solder. You can just kind of just, if you can touch them both at the same time, you could commonly just gently kind of send them down. Well, here, let me add a little solder. Make it a little easier. And hopefully that we can just push them down. There we go. And it just falls through just like that. Now you do want to be careful because there are pads on the other side. Let's see if I can show that to you. There are these 2 pads, so if you force them, if you push them really hard down, you could actually rip these pads, which you don't want to do. You saw the capacitor just fall naturally, and so that will prevent damage to the pad. We do want to clean up those spots there. So let's get our wick. Clean it up with some isopropyl alcohol, both sides. Let's see, the positive is on this side, so I want the negative on the opposite side. So let's go ahead and punch this through, just like that. There you go, we're going to be soldering that end, but make sure that everything's right, correct. Add a touch of flux. And then solder them in place. snip off the extras. Clean up your work. And there you go. The first capacitor is in. We'll do that to the next two. And there you go. All three are in. This one's now a little smaller than this one. Don't worry about the size difference. Modern capacitors tend to be a little smaller than their predecessors. So don't worry about that. So we are done with power supply. We'll go ahead and put this back in and work on the soundboard. Okay, so for the soundboard, there are 5 capacitors we want to remove. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are surface mount. They are a little more difficult than the other ones just because you can't really expose the leads very well. There's really 3 ways of doing this. One of them is definitely wrong. Do not just try to desolder the leads here. So here's a capacitor right here. There's a kind of a lead sticking out there. That's the positive end. The negative end is on this side right here. And that can get really hard to do, and you can damage adjacent components. You'll start melting this plastic here. So the 2 ways, well, the one way I recommend is just kind of figure out where the leads are. So it's right there and right there. And you just really want to take some snips, and you'll notice that there's a little bit of a line, kind of an indentation right here. Where the capacitor is. You can just essentially get in there and cut it, and then you can kind of work. So you're basically cutting through the capacitor, you're cutting through the leads, and then you can take the bottom metal off and then slip off the plastic part on the bottom, and then you can remove the legs once everything's exposed. Another technique I've heard is you can perhaps kind of in line with these 2 leads, you can kind of try to rock this capacitor slowly back and forth until the legs break. I tend to think that causes a little more stress. So now you don't want to cut it this way because then you'll kind of like squeeze those legs. You want to cut them the same direction as the legs. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Try to get this thing as far in as we can. There, and then we're just going to cut this thing right through. Just like that. And now you can see the legs here are exposed. And then you can try to get this little piece off there. And then you can get this metal piece off more easy. Oops, come on, get off there. And there you go. And then these legs can just be desoldered right off, and that will prevent damage to your entire board. So I should have mentioned that we're only looking at 2 different kinds of capacitors here. 3 of them are 100 microfarads at 6 volts. We're going to replace them with 6.3 volts. And then the other 2 are 47 microfarads, and those are rated at 4 volts. And then you just want to prep each little peg here. Desoldering. So some of them already came off, but they should just come off with the iron here. As you can see here, here's a leg right there. Just kind of remove them before you clean off all the solder. Here's a leg here, if you could see that. Okay, now that all the legs are removed, now we could just use our wick to remove the residual solder from the pads. Okay, so I think I got the pads pretty clean. I'm gonna just use some isopropyl alcohol. Unfortunately, I wasn't being as careful as I should have been, and I did melt a little bit of these connector plugs, as you can see here. It's really tight quarters, so be very careful of those plugs. do what I say and not what I do. So there you go. Everybody screws up. So let's just go ahead and clean these pads in preparation for the new caps. So for these bigger caps, 1, 2, 3, I have these little guys right here, and you're gonna have to kind of splay. If you're gonna use electrolytic capacitors, you're gonna need to splay the legs like this. So when you put them down, you have some place to solder. And so you want to trim off these like that. That's about a good size right there, I think. Just like that, if you could see that. And then I'm going to start with one leg and do one leg at a time. So I'm going to probably start with the negative side. To the pad. Let's turn this around. There you go. And then do the positive side. That looks good. Go ahead and clean up the work and then go ahead and do the rest. Now, what I do recommend is don't kind of box yourself in. I'm gonna do this one next, maybe this one, just because they're tight quarters, and then I'll do the outside ones. Okay, so I got all the caps in. You can see they're right here. So let's go ahead and get this back in the game and see what happens. Okay, so for the moment of truth, I reassembled everything, put the power board on, the soundboard in, it closes okay, got all the screws in. Go ahead and put our Sonic 2 in here, plug it in, and see what happens. Hopefully we get sound this time. Okay, so let's see, sound is up all the way, and we turn it on. It lights up, that's a good sign. Hey, check it out, Sega! Perfect. We have our sound back on. Volume control. Very good. Well, it looks like our recap project actually fixed this Game Gear. Well, I'm extremely happy with the results of this project. So we got this Game Gear working perfectly again. And of course, you know, we still have to deal with this really washed out screen, which was the original Game Gear monitor. But hey, you know, I may actually do another video sometime in the future. There's a screen mod you can do. It's called the McMill. I think it's an LCD screen mod that you can do and make these things crystal clear and bright. No backlighting, it's all in the LCD. So I may do that in the future, and if I do, you'll see the link at the end. If I don't, you won't see that link. So we'll see how much effort I want to put into this, but I'm happy with this. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button at the bottom of the screen, and even consider subscribing to my channel. I have many more videos to come. Bye-bye.